So last night I again slept really well. I slept from maybe about 10:30 to 9 a.m., making sleep my number one priority. And that was my first night with the lower dosage, from half the amount I was taking initially to 3/8. And the chunk of trazodone is getting really small, and I had this psychosomatic reaction like, wow, I'm only taking that much for sleep. And it was almost a fear of if I would be able to fall asleep or not. But I did fall asleep, and it might have taken a little bit longer, but not too bad. And I went rollerblading yesterday, and today I'm just taking it easy. It's really hot outside, so I thought I might do a bit of self-dialogue, see if I can get into it. I'm wondering if I'll be able to get through this bunch of notes in my notebook in the next month, because today is the 11 months anniversary of talking to myself in self-dialogue, and I did imagine that I would do it for a year. I didn't think I would do it for a year when I started talking to myself. I just, at a certain point, set an arbitrary date saying, well, this is when I really started, so let's see how long this will go. And then at some point I thought, well, I'll just do this for a year. So in sticking with the year, at least for the first anniversary of the self-dialogue, then I will just keep going. And maybe that will be the self-dialogue anniversary, and after that I'll keep going, but doing something a little bit different. I don't know what that is yet. And I was even thinking about how when this process first started about 6 years ago, before I had any kind of label or diagnosis, and that process was just going on for a good 2 months, and it was full of energy, and it was scary at times and ecstatic at times. I'm wondering if any of that will come back, because that process was interrupted by the context through which it was received, which was the mental health system. And it was drugged and it was suppressed, and it's been warped in all these different ways by the mental health system. But in being on micronutrients, will some of it come back, but will I have a new context to operate within that field? And I'm wondering if some of the good stuff will come back, some of the so-called manic energies, but perhaps they won't be so manic. Perhaps they won't be so out of control with the micronutrients. So all this time I've been on medication, what will it be like not having any of that stuff in my system? Will some other kind of process get initiated? Will there be totally different things to learn? Being out of that context of being chemically constrained, what's going to happen? It's completely unknown. And I was wondering a bit about that, because I was talking to myself about what will I talk about in the context of having a label yet not needing the meds, if that happens. But what will I talk about if it's just a completely different dimension altogether? If it's just living in those areas that I've talked to myself at length about, but without the caveat of relating it to mental illness all the time. Because if I'm not on those drugs, what is it? Is it a mental illness? I don't know. And what's going to happen? I don't know. So it was interesting to think about that. And I wrote something down, and it's kind of related, but it's more related on the scary side. I wrote, in that living scared state, if we are approached in a mechanical way, we can tell gesturetically, meaning we can read into that. It makes it worse. We are afraid of being mechanized again. People responding machine-like, and with their judgment, it is the buzzkill. They translate the living according to the mechanism. Humans are mechanisms of thought. So that's related to how we have all this living energy, and it's all diverse and dynamic, and it tries to be categorized by other human beings, trying to mechanize the person who is accessing that living energy. And I wrote down thought as unnatural selection. We are selecting for words, categories, and language, and superimposing those over life. So we don't see what language itself is doing, and we need to use language to point out the limitations of language itself. And maybe we need some new words for that. And language used to be more metaphoric, more based on relationships. So even when people were trying to create the language of mathematics, they were using relationships between things in order to create it. So the relationship between Earth and the moon to figure out the pull of gravity of the planets, etc. I'm just making this up. And the theory of relativity. So math and relativity are somewhat based on relationships, but when we use language in daily life, we use it like it is what is, that it's not describing relationships and things that are relative. And we're dividing ourselves from nature using math and language the way we do now. When maybe when it was initially coming about, it was tied closely with nature and with relationships and to the things they actually represent. But now they've taken on this life of their own, like they're actually important. So we've more related them to the person who's speaking them, and then those words a person is speaking is them, and that's what we value and identify with, and somebody attacks those words, then we're all mad. But it hasn't really touched the actual thing, but we're taking the words as more important. So a language of perception wouldn't necessarily divide us from what we see. It would be more mathematically correct. So the real science could be speaking the language of the moment and speaking about the me as of the past words instead of the past. And then in this way we're using language in service of the moment, not in service of this past structure called me. I wrote down an interesting sentence. See the beauty in how the terror renews the brain. Is that energy the light in my brain that's erasing stuff to make way for new structures? There are no things, there are only relationships. Things are the word. Words block light and make things, or light creates language of relationships in the moment. We need a quantum language. And they're figuring out the quantum world in science. But if we actually spoke a language of quantum, we would just live in the quantum world. We wouldn't necessarily have to have scientists looking into it. I feel a label, like a mental illness label, encloses a person in a cage of wrong meanings. And we have to create our brain. It's not fully formed or structured. Just like we need to see in utero somewhat in order to create the visual cortex in the brain. We need to keep seeing throughout life to keep recreating our brain. And there's a lot of talk about neuroplasticity. Well, I feel the ego me is what prevents neuroplasticity, because in terms of what it's seeing in the present. So it's like a contraction that's constantly happening in the brain, and that's making those brain cells stronger, the brain cells of the past. But if we don't see through the past, then those brain cells wither away, and there's room for more plasticity. The current way our brain sees separates us from everything else. We don't see the relatedness. I feel this energy is trying to remap the brain for beauty and richness instead of all these words. The brain is divided up by a bunch of words. And map consciousness pulls the future possibility of this beautiful world towards us. I feel like there can be an immediacy of the mind, of reality, playing on the brain, instead of thought tape loops playing on the brain cells. And the thought tape loops create the brain cells in a certain way, in a certain rigid way. But the brain cells meeting reality would move them fluidly, like a hand playing a musical instrument, reality meeting the brain cells, versus the brain cells always firing with this noise. And thought causes premature collapse of the wave function and pinhole perception, which is no perception at all. I feel like thought is the switch that moves us off our center of consciousness and center of gravity. So usually we're caught in a language loop or a thought loop, and this blocks perception, blocks the information coming in. But when there's an in-touchness, when perception touches reality, it creates language based on what it's seeing, not based on the past thoughts and thought structures that are arising in the mind and making associations with the present moment that have nothing to do with the present moment. So that in-touchness creates the language of the moment. And then we're giving voice to beauty. Beauty can only be of the moment. And maybe that's why it's so fleeting, and that's why we only have moments of awe ever so often, because that's actually the beauty that is quite evasive when we're lost in our thoughts. We're lost in this world of thought and thought structures as opposed to being lost in a world of beauty. For some reason, we're more comfortable with the familiarity of thoughts than the unfamiliar territory of meeting beauty. And again, I'm just making stuff up. I'm speaking in terms of possibilities, perceptions, insights, and these are ones that I had a couple months ago. So they're not carrying the energy that they did at the moment of perceiving them. At the moment of perceiving something, it's different energy altogether than even the moment of writing it down after. And then speaking it a time later, it's even less energy. So ideally, there would be an in-touchness of just connecting with that each moment and not having this process of writing it down and then speaking about it later. Really, it would be living this every moment of life and not making a video about it. So whenever we have a moment of awe, of beauty, it suspends the me temporarily. And we're in a completely different dimension. And then if we go too far in that, we get lost. And to come back to the me when we go too far into beauty is so-called psychosis sometimes for people. It's in my body to bring that consciousness back to the me structure, because that's the way society is structured, and it's difficult to go too far into beauty. If one was just perceiving beauty every moment, if one was just in awe every moment, that would create a different life around that being than the one of listening and paying attention to one's thoughts and past. One would be so in touch with the moment. And if we're that in touch with the moment, what place has the past? And then the trouble with coming back to the me after going that far into beauty is it seems so meaningless, and the structures of society seem so meaningless to the point that the brain has trouble participating with them and taking them seriously. So that's where embody one's mania comes in. It's important to harvest that and get back to that state. So can we play in this world of beauty? Can we play with beauty instead of playing so much with thought and having thought play through our brains? Can we have beauty play through our brains? And I wonder what kind of supplementation would help a brain stay in the quantum state as opposed to coming back to the me state. I wonder what kind of nutrition the brain needs to live in beauty. It would be a different nutrient profile, perhaps. Because even taking these micronutrients that I'm taking, if it does the same thing as the medication was doing, but at least it's not poisoning me because it's nutrition, it's still keeping me grounded in this reality. And initially my brain wanted to go into a different reality, and I still think there's something to that. So I'm hoping this nutrition will help me harvest, practice, embody better, and perhaps find a way for the brain to stay living in beauty and not burn out, because beauty requires a lot of energy. It's a very high energy state. And the thing with that high energy state is that energy wants to be shared. So it's not just about how can I keep my brain in that energy, it's about how to channel that energy so it's actually a channel. It could be not that the brain runs out of energy, it could be that it gets short-circuited by too much energy that's not being shared to other brains. It's a relational energy. And the trouble is too, when we do try and share, a lot of times it's met with skepticism, and people are wondering what we're all about. And I think part of the trouble is that we talk to people that we know, and they say, you're being different. But if we really wandered, if we were really with strangers, they wouldn't necessarily know that something has changed. It's almost like needing to disappear after one has gone through this transformation. It's almost like dying and being reborn. It's almost like if one was to fake one's own death, one would have to disappear from everybody they knew. I remember feeling like I had to fake my own death, but maybe I didn't. Maybe it was more just needing to be out of the eyes of people that I know. And that's one thing I'm concerned about when I go back. I love my family and friends, but at the same time, I'm wondering about this mutation thing, and if that process wants to initiate again, what will I have to do to, I don't know, I'm not sure. And I wrote down that awakening is from a small sense of self. I think I was listening to a talk called How to Train Your Brain to Live an Awakened Life by Locke Kelly, I think. These are old notes. And I feel like map consciousness definitely awakens us from a small sense of self. And to me, psychiatry is against this. It's keeping that small sense of self intact. To me, society has to adapt to allow for this expanded sense of self. What would that even look like? And apparently the posterior cingulate cortex, or the PCC, is what is responsible for all the mind chatter. And I wrote down PC consciousness, computer consciousness. To me, the PCC chatter is like the screensaver. It's when the organism or the computer is just sleeping. And awe and beauty stops the PCC chatter. So really only beauty can stop it. Perhaps the beauty of the heart and the love in the heart. And I wonder if the ego is a hologram. It's a hologram that interferes with the brain. It actually makes us see images holographically that interfere with seeing actually. And can this human mind, this actual human mind, become our trait? This living mind that we can all access, we just don't because of the way our brains are conditioned. We become traits of the mind. We become traits of the universe. Forget us having traits.